In 1 Samuel chapter 17, we find the entire story of David and Goliath. So welcome to story time. Pretend that you're out in East Tennessee at one of those storytelling festivals. Sit back and listen for the lessons. Now, David was a shepherd boy and was the son of Jesse, which made him Ruth and Boaz's great-grandson. He was the youngest of all his 8 brothers, and he was kind of short in stature, but he was really healthy and strong. He was a pretty good kid. He did what his parents asked him to do. He watched his father's sheep. Now, David was also very musically gifted. He was so much so that he was like a musical therapist for King Saul. So whenever the king would suffer, David would go to the king and play his lyre for him, and the music would calm the king down. Anytime the king needed him, David would be there, and then he'd go right back to watching his father's sheep. There was this one day, David was watching his father's sheep, and they were laying out in the grass all peaceful and calm. The sun was shining. And all of a sudden, David heard a "Rrrr." He looked, and it was a lion. He was scared, but he didn't run. He remembered God was good to his people. So he grabbed that lion by the mane and threw that sucker down and beat it. He saved his father's sheep. He remembered God was good to him. There was another day. David was watching his father's sheep over here, and the sun was shining down, and they were just munching away, happy day. And all of a sudden, David heard a "Rrrr." He looked, and it was a bear. He was scared, but he didn't run. He remembered God had helped him with the lion. So he said, "Oh, God, help me." And he grabbed that bear by the jawbone and punched that sucker in the throat and threw him down. He saved his father's sheep. He remembered God was good to him. Now, David was so very talented and likable that his brothers sometimes got jealous of him. If you have brothers or sisters, then you know what sibling rivalry is like. Well, David's family had that too, just like the rest of us. Now, 3 of his older brothers had gone down to the battlefield to fight for the Israelite army against the Philistines. Normally, the Israelites would have already kicked the Philistines' rear end, but this time the Philistines had a secret weapon. And to make matters worse, the Israelite army leader, King Saul, was not down there leading his men into battle. He had become so depressed that he was becoming confused. See, he had forgotten God had been good to him. At this point in King Saul's life, his mentor, the prophet Samuel, had left him. And so Saul felt that God had left him too. And we all know when the leader is afraid, sometimes the people are too. Sure enough, the Israelites had forgotten that God had been good to them and had saved them many times in the past. Actually, they tended to forget that a lot. They had short memories. But unlike them, David has a strong faith in God. Now, on this day, David is not a shepherd boy. He has left the sheep with a sheep babysitter. He is an errand boy. His father, Jesse, has sent him down to go to the battlefield to bring his brothers and the men some food. And David is really excited to get to go down there and see his brothers being so brave for the people. He runs all the way from Jesse's house with a bag of bread and a bag of cheese. And as soon as he gets there, he sees the men have already left the camp and they're marching down toward the battlefield shouting their war cry, we will rock you." He is so proud of his brothers. But then he sees the men. They stop suddenly. He runs on down and he sees why. This huge lunken man, this giant wearing 150 pounds of armor, standing 9 feet tall, steps out from the Philistine army into the middle of the battlefield and yells at the Israelites, "Come on down here and fight me, you bunch of lily-livered chickens." His name was Goliath. David watched his brothers and the Israelites start to tremble with fear, and they turned around and ran, screaming, "Run away, run away!" But David, that giant, made him so mad. He said, "Who does this giant, uncircumcised, rotten dog think he is? He thinks he can defy the armies of the living God?" And so David asked the men, "What does the king say that he'll do for the man that defeats this giant?" But David's big brother, Eliab, yelled at David, "What are you doing here? Did you leave our father's sheep unattended? You just came down here to watch the show, didn't you?" And David said, What did I do now? It was just a question, Eliab. So he asked some other men, and the men told him, the king says he will give the man money, his own daughter, and he'll make the man's entire family free from ever having to pay taxes again. So David said, oh, that sounds great. Well, very quickly, word spread back to King Saul that David was down here talking about all this with the soldiers. So King Saul sent for David. King Saul did not even recognize David. Like I said, he had been getting confused. But David didn't mind that. He knew the king suffered from time to time. After all, King Saul had forgotten that God was good to him, and that can make anyone sick. So David told him, hey, look, you really don't have to worry about this old uncircumcised giant. God has helped me take down a lion. He's helped me take down a bear. He'll help me take down this rotten dog too. And the king said, oh, no, you can't do that. You're just a boy. But David said, the hand of the Lord that saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of the Philistine. David remembered God is good to him. So King Saul said, okay, but you're going to need to wear my armor. So David put on the king's armor, and he clunked around in it for a little. He's like, yeah, I can't do this. I'm not used to it. But I've got my staff, and I've got my sling, and I know God will help me. So he picked up some smooth stones, he put them in his pocket, and he headed down to the battlefield to meet the stinking man. As soon as the giant saw David, the insults began. What are you doing here, you little mama boy? Don't you need to go home and change your diaper? Well, David heard him, and he thought, oh, God help me. He kept walking towards the giant. The trash talking continued. Hey there, little scrawny boy, what you gonna do, throw sticks at my feet? I could crush your head. And now David started running at him, and he had his sling going above his head, and he let that stone fly, and it hit that giant right in the middle of the head, knocked him out. He fell face first in the dirt. Then David ran over there, took his own sword, and cut off his head. The Philistines ran screaming. The battle was won by a shepherd boy with a slingshot and a strong faith in God. There are many lessons we can learn from this story. Almost anything can become a metaphorical Goliath to us. Oppression, unjust situations, a struggle to find a good job, addiction, even old ideas that we've been hanging on to about ourselves or about other people that we thought might have been true, but they're not. Those old ideas can become a Goliath to overcome. And an addiction can not just become a Goliath for a person and their family, but for an entire community. But we can always remember the times in our past when God has saved us from the bear or the lion, and we can trust that God will be good to us again. If you are like the Israelites and you're having a hard time remembering all the times that God saved you in the past, or if you are like King Saul and you're having a hard time remembering that God is good at all, let me assure you from my personal experiences in bear wrestling that as you begin to turn more and more of your life over to the care of God, even if it's just a little bit at a time, God will direct your steps to overcome any Goliath that stands in God's way for you. Amen.